Hey everyone, wanted to thank you for joining me on this webinar. This presentation is one of 6 that I give that really discuss some topics relative to the art of coaching. It builds off of those mentioned in my book and also adds some new insight and new research done over the past 15 to 20 years from a coaching science standpoint, and even some strategies that most people don't know about that date back as far as 30 years. Many coaches out there can relate to the fact that even though we can learn the technical aspects of our job related to, program design, exercise demonstration, teaching different movements, there is a huge gap as it pertains to the art of coaching. For a long time, people have just kind of addressed it as relationships and, trust, but it's so much more than that. A lot of it hinges on behavioral science. And today I'm going to give you a brief snippet or look into this. So for more information, I do have a course. It comes out on June 27th and relaunches on artofcoaching.com. Some of this information that you see here is going to be discussed in the course. The course, of course, goes into much greater depth. It also includes a variety of guides, manuals, and also references as well. But to dive into it, I always like to start this presentation by asking people what you believe to be more predictable, the weather or somebody's behavior. Now, at face value, this may seem completely separate and even a very odd question to ask. But upon further investigation, you're going to see how they're really more closely related and can change the framework and paradigms in which we think about human behavior, and thus our approach to the art of coaching. So when we look at how they're similar, first and foremost, the relative prediction of either is really dependent on a measure of time. So if you look at these definitions, particularly of weather to start off, weather is defined as what the conditions of the atmosphere are over a short period of time. So this can change minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, and season to season. If you're from where I'm from in the Midwest, we always have a joke that if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes and it'll change on you. Climate, on the other hand, and these are two words that people often get confused, is the average of weather over time and space. So in other words, climate is what you would expect. You go to certain areas of the world, you know what to expect if you're in a desert. If you're in more of a tropical climate, you get the idea of on average what you can expect to see there. Weather is very much unpredictable on the other hand. It can be, even if you're in a place such as Phoenix, Arizona, in which the picture of the right was taken, huge dust storms can come seemingly out of nowhere. Windstorms, as depicted by the left. The image on the left, it can be a normally fine day or even slightly overcast, and all of a sudden weather can change in an instant. And you see this happen in coaching as well. And I use this time lapse to illustrate that. Oftentimes you can start a session and things can seem fine. Everything's going according to plan. But just because an athlete perhaps broke up with somebody, had some instances of some bad things going on at home, or any number of factors, what was normally a nice, sunny kind of disposition can change into a stormy or tumultuous session because there's so many distractions going on, or any other number of factors. It's also not dependent just on the athletes. Coaches can have bad sessions. That session can start well, and then some things get out of control. And again, just as you see with this, it doesn't take long for those conditions and the environment to change. So let's look at now how behavior relates to weather. Well, emotion, much like the weather example given before, is one's affective state of consciousness and can change minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, and season to season. However, one's behavior is very similar to kind of like the climate example. It's an aggregate of responses to an internal and external stimuli. So social and cultural norms can influence it, environment, and also elements of relatedness. Now, if you're wondering where this is coming from, guys, understand that a big part of knowing about the art of coaching and how to master it or buy-in comes from getting a better grasp on emotions, behavior, everything that influences our choices, our decisions. So knowing these things is important. And it also gives you a better idea and context of the definitions, because we know how quickly and easily certain words can be used in an irresponsible or inappropriate manner, and then that changes the context of both the study and argument completely. So a lot of people tend to think that the art of coaching, well, at least they used to think the art of coaching was a soft science, that there wasn't much research. But it doesn't take much digging to really find that both from a psychosocial standpoint behavioral economic standpoint, really all of these domains, there is far more research on the art of coaching and everything involved in that than there is the science of training. And it's never a battle about which one is more important. A great coach understands that they have to have a grasp on both. The thing that makes the art of coaching a bit more interesting is that since it's such a complex interpersonal system that's heavily interdependent and fast moving, it is not as predictable as certain elements of training can be. And the only way that we can address this is by creating more skilled practitioners who know how to navigate this social landscape. So this is a framework that I've created based on the research that looks at all the different things that affect both the behavioral outcomes we hope to achieve, as well as the communication and influence tactics we need to use in order to achieve those goals. So you can see this is very much like periodization of program design, but for people. When we make a program, we have to think about, all right, what are the athletes' needs? What are their wants even? Looking at movement efficiency, looking at force velocity profiles, looking at everything that goes into an athlete's performance, even the logistics of the training session, the time frame, what we have available to us. Well, in this context, behavioral outcomes are determined in large part by drives, which are discussed in my book, Conscious Coaching, in depth, as well as in my course. The environment, which can be the physical environment, cultural environment, and even perceived environment on behalf of the athletes. And then social factors, not only verbal and nonverbal, but internal, and that can even apply to media, peers, and all of these aspects as well. So when we're trying to make sense of these things, it can be helpful to look at behavior in an archetypical fashion. And archetypes are something that I explain in my book and the course, and it is not a judgment. Really what it is it's a very typical example of a certain person or thing. You can look at it as an original that has been imitated or a recurrent symbol or motif. You can also think of it as kind of this first mold if you want to look at the origin of the term. And we're already familiar with archetypes in society, right? This is taken from a classic movie called The Breakfast Club, which talks about some teenagers that tend to get themselves into some interesting experiences. And in the movie, there's the criminal, the athlete, the basket case, the princess. But you see this in movies all the time. The hero, the villain. We see this on social media. There's people that always get on political rants. People that always show pictures of their food. People that do any number of things. It's a typical example of a behavior as it's characterized either in private or in public. And it all speaks to the fact that individuals go to a tremendous effort in order to try and manage the image that they wish to convey to others. Even if you're somebody that claims to not care whatsoever about what people think, unknowingly that is really a part of your whole image. You many times people like this perceive themselves as kind of devil may care or take it as it comes, and what you see is what you get. But by and large, everything from the way you do your hair in the morning to the clothes that you wear before you go out and coach or the brands that you affiliate with are all part of you trying to manage that image. And your athletes do the same thing. There's always subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways in which they express themselves that give true insight and unique insight into how you can better address things as a coach, how you can better speak their language, and how you can better really infiltrate their world so you can become a more effective practitioner. It may be helpful for those of you that are visual learners to think of an archetype as a scaffolding, right? It's the part of the building that goes up, that framework, so to speak, where it doesn't show everything in tremendous detail, but it does give you this superficial kind of mold or cast of, all right, I have a general idea. This athlete tends to behave in this manner. I have some other athletes in the weight room that behave in a different manner. And in the book, I go over 16 of these different archetypes, and they're discussed much more in depth in the course. And we're going to give you some examples of it here. But I want to make sure that I drive home how you can think of these examples so they don't seem so foreign to you at first glance. So we all have a coaching compass, a mode of operation that really gives us an idea of how we should navigate and operate certain social situations. And it's tough because our athletes will have a variety, guys, of different kind of characteristics and traits they can enact, right? Some are a little bit more passive, some are touchy, restless, aggressive, while others may be a little bit more sociable, outgoing, talkative, responsive. All these things really manifest themselves into these different examples. So here's a few taken directly from the book and the course. One of which you may encounter when you're dealing with athletes is the royal. Now, the royal is somebody who possesses an aura of entitlement or superiority. They're typically a pretty skilled athlete, and they've been told how great they are. They've, typically experienced a high level of success. And, any of these archetypes, the traits that they possess are never bad or good in singularity. These things don't exist in a vacuum. Every virtue has an accompanying vice. So strengths, well, as much as we say ego is the enemy and people shouldn't have an ego, all human beings have an ego. Some are just more elevated than others. It's impossible to go through life in an ego-less fashion. It's just a spectrum or scale in which your ego manifests itself. And when you're dealing with competitive athletes, you need to keep in mind we need them to have some semblance of an ego. If they didn't have an ego that they were highly protective of, then they wouldn't be competitive in the first place. So we need athletes that, it's normal to have athletes with a certain sense of egotism and competitiveness. Where it becomes problematic in the case of the royal is that competency is not always as high as their ego or sense of competitiveness, right? They tend to think they don't need the same level of instruction as everybody else. And this is kind of what you see manifest itself in weaknesses. A lot of times the royal will have excessive pride, they're excessively status seeking, there's this entitlement about them. All right, so how do you connect with them? Well, one way to do so is making your message about them or the status they seek. And we're not going to go into too many examples due to the nature of this webinar, and a lot of it is covered more in depth in the course and in the book. But it's as simple as, guys, if you have somebody that's worried about getting faster, really crafting all your messaging around the training or what you want them to do around speed and the acquisition of more speed or more bursts or more acceleration is a big piece there. You have to learn how to speak their language. The worst thing that you could do is go up to them and try to really regurgitate a ton of science and say, hey, you know what? Squatting heavy increases motor unit recruitment, and just really regurgitate all this stuff that really they don't care about. And it's not dumbing it down, because when you're around other coaches, when you're around your staff, you can speak to these things. You can really dive deeply into the science of it. But you have to understand that not every athlete enjoys training. And that's not a great approach to really try to get the royal bought in by trying to talk over their heads. We also have the politician. The politician is a socially dynamic and confident individual who really employs a lot of manipulative tactics. It's the athlete that's always looking to debate with you why they're doing this exercise, not really asking just questions, but actually debate with you. Or they want to get out of a certain, I don't want to do this type of conditioning today. There's always some deal to be made on the side of the politician. And many of you watching this are likely smiling because members either that you played of your staff, people that you completed or played with in the past, or other athletes who have this kind of politician-based mentality. There's always something they're trying to weasel out of or change so it gives them an advantage. So you can see their inherent strengths and weaknesses, how to connect with them. A lot of times you have to communicate with these types directly. You have to humanize the interaction, cut through the BS, and let them know that you're on to their game. The worst thing you can do is start to engage in that back and forth with them because they're pulling you into their territory, right? And this applies in far more than just coaching. A lot of this applies in day-to-day interaction on social media or in person as well. You have to make sure that you make it very clear what you're asking them to do, very clear why they're being asked to do that, and also very clear that there's no way around this, that it's a necessary prerequisite for them to achieve their goals and for you guys to achieve the bigger goals as a team. So the politician is not somebody that you want to get drug into the mud with. And we have the novice. The novice is that overeager athlete or person who's new to a pursuit, but they also think that they're ready for everything, right? It can be great to have somebody with a blank slate mentality, but if, so many novices want to jump in, I want to squat with bands and chains, or I want to snatch and use the velocity measurement device. They want to jump right into it. And this can be problematic because they don't understand the necessary progression that needs to take place. And this happens with coaches as well. How many of you know coaches who want to jump immediately into training pro athletes and they think that pro athletes and Olympic athletes are the end all be all? when in reality, these coaches would benefit tremendously from working with kids and youth athletes and developmental athletes. Not only are those things oftentimes harder, right, but it gives the coach a more well-rounded experience and really creates this enhanced career capital that builds their skill set more complete fashion than it would just working with one subset. Now, working with professional athletes definitely brings in a different nuance in that a lot of times, at least in my experience, especially here dealing with NFL athletes, which is my predominant population, you have to get into these kind of social and political back and forth with them a little bit. There is a psychological element when you're dealing with 20 to 30 millionaires who are highly skilled, even amongst the best at what they do, and you have to play chess, not checkers, to get them to kind of fall in line. Where it's a little bit easier for younger, more novice athletes, you to say, hey, to get to the next level, this is what you need to achieve. That really can connect with them. Doesn't always connect with the pros. All right, so we look at some strengths, and the novice is clean slated. They're typically very enthusiastic. But the weakness is they're often easily overwhelmed, they're impatient, and they make hasty decisions. Being able to recognize these things and being able to create a way that you can help them navigate common mistakes associated with novice-type behavior and naivete is a critical skill for you as a coach. We have the underdog. To briefly touch on this here, this is an individual that's always at a disadvantage. They always are expected to lose, right? So they have this chip on their shoulder and they go hard at everything they do, which can be great to a point. But if they start to push themselves excessively in everything, right, like that self-doubt, that hesitancy, that anxiety can become a double-edged sword and actually bring them farther away from their goals. So it's tricky as a coach. You want those athletes that come in that want to do extra, that want to be as adherent to the program as possible and then some. But by feeding into that too much, you can also harm them and get them into scenarios where that those same virtues really become a vice and get them farther from that. You have the Wolverine, which admittedly is a bit of what I both am as a person and was as an athlete. Now, this is somebody that is typically a little bit more distrustful or withdrawn, not because they don't buy into things, but they just tend to operate better on their own. This is somebody that you should expect. You shouldn't expect to see them overly enthusiastic or jumping up and down. They're going to be a little bit more reserved. They're going to kind of sit back and observe everybody else around them. Sometimes they can even be a little bit standoffish. I've worked with athletes, one in particular, who saw one of his parents killed right in front of him. That athlete has been through a lot. That athlete grew up from a hard upbringing. And a lot of times coaches would address him and just, say, so-and-so is withdrawn. They don't seem like they're engaged at all. Well, they can be perfectly engaged. So it really the Wolverine really speaks to, how important it is as a coach for you to investigate and observe as opposed to just blindly judge and think that you see what you're seeing. You have to engage with these athletes, and you have to understand that, somebody that is a Wolverine, they have a high level of self-sufficiency. They typically have a fiery demeanor. They do have a weakness of distrust, fear, and anger sometimes, or just being withdrawn, and some of them can be, not as socially extroverted. But these are things that, you guys really want this. You want to have people with different personalities in your program, in your company, within the team, because they all kind of serve their role. And really, Wolverines can be some of the best leaders on the team because they're able to detach themselves a little bit more emotionally than some of the other folks can. Their highs aren't as high and their lows aren't as low. And really being able to know how to address them and how to connect with them is key. And again, I know I'm going fast here. It's a lot of information. It's 300 pages in the book and 5 weeks worth of information in the course, in which we provide out handouts and materials of how to work with these athletes more in depth. We're just touching on them in kind of a base manner here. You have the leader, which doesn't really require much explanation. The leader is that somebody who's out in front. They want to provide direction for others. They love to influence others, and then knowing their strengths and weaknesses are critical as well, because even though there can be so many strengths inherent to leaders, the weaknesses, they'll always carry the burden of others, which can affect their performance. They tend to have a lot of pride, which can be great, but sometimes they need to know when to step aside and also delegate. And that's why these archetypes don't just exist as it pertains to athletes, but it's also a coaching thing as well. Coaches fit into these archetypical modes, and you as a leader, if you work with a team or organization, not knowing how to delegate and always trying to take on more yourself can be a crippling experience that eventually leads to burnout if you're not careful. So, early on, one of the big criticisms I received, and this typically was from people that just kind of read the archetype section of the book and nothing else, is that people felt like, well, you can't just coach based off that. No question. And that would never, ever, ever be implied. When you're coaching, you cannot just look at one's behavior or traits that they possess in isolation. And I talk a lot about this in the book and the course. You also have to consider the environment and context. So, one, behavior can never fully be predicted. Nobody is ever one archetype all the time. Many of you can relate to this. When you're coaching, you're one way. When you're at home with your spouse, you may be a different way. When you're in a different environment, you can act in different ways. And so when people think, oh, this person is a Wolverine, this person is a leader, and they try to put them into a bucket, really they're missing the larger piece of the puzzle that says, okay, you also need to consider external factors and context. You also need to look at the situation that individual's finding themselves in. These things in totality give you a bigger, more full-scale view of really the personality traits and behaviors that you're hoping to influence. And we'll talk about a few of them here. Before we do, one of my favorite quotes on this is from General Stanley McChrystal, who in his book, Team of Teams, said that an organization or organism's fitness, and we're defining fitness here as the ability to perform a task, cannot be assessed in a vacuum. It is always a product of its compatibility and adaptability with the surrounding environment. And guys, that's a hallmark of great coaching. Knowing not only how to observe and interact and prescribe, but most importantly, how to adapt. So let's look at the role of environment here briefly. And one thing that's interesting in the research looks at this, research dating as far back as 1977, is a term known as the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error states that we tend to often assume that behavior is representative of internal factors, such as one's personality or disposition. And we tend to subsequently underestimate the influence that external factors, such as situational influences, may have on behavior. So one such example, I used to live in Los Angeles, and it's not uncommon when you're driving in traffic in Los Angeles to get pretty heated. You'd start speeding, and you'd see other people cutting in and out of lanes, right? And we tend to think, man, that person's insane. When in reality, a lot of times when we do it, we justify it by saying, hey, I'm late, I'm trying to get somewhere, I need you to move. Well, it is that kind of judgment we make on other people who may be doing the exact same thing that we are either doing currently or that we've done in the past. But instead of thinking, well, maybe they're late for an appointment, maybe they're trying to get to work, maybe a family member is sick, we tend to just look at it and say, that person's insane. They're driving crazy. They don't know how to do X, Y, or Z. This is a hallmark example of the fundamental attribution error, in that we tend to explain our own behavior with situation-based causes and other people's behavior with person or personality-based causes. So you justify yours by really, saying, hey, the context was such that I had to, do this and I was justified. We don't give other people that same benefit of the doubt. And that leads to faulty decision-making, bias, and even heuristics when we're trying to look and better understand our athletes. A comic that I love that illustrates this, right, shows that, why are you always so anxious to criticize me? And the other character says, well, I just have a knack for seeing other people's faults, which is really how all of us are innately. And then they say, well, what about your own faults? And she responds, well, I have a knack for overlooking those. So it really speaks to the critical point of you as a coach being able to really look inwardly and understand that, you've really got to take a step back from situations in order to better identify them and see them for what they truly are. And there's a lot of really famous research articles about this that exist, especially the hallmark research articles from the 20th century, one of which was performed by Stanley Milgram. Now, before getting into this, Stanley Milgram had stated it's not so much the kind of person that a man is as the situation in which he finds themselves that determines how they will act. And any of you familiar with the Milgram experiments, know, how this came to be. Stanley Milgram was trying to look at people's tendency to obey to authority. They were looking at, why are not really the Nazis listening to Hitler, because these experiments were conducted to better make sense of the events of World War II. Why are these seemingly normal people, really committing such atrocities? And he wanted to see how that took place. So what he did is he recruited a number of participants to partake in a study in which shocks, or really fake shocks, were elicited to an individual that was asked a certain question. And if they got that question wrong, a shock was administered. And he wanted to see how far people would go, the people that were administering this shock, knowing that these shocks could lead to permanent injury or death. Now, the study was contentious because unknowingly to the participants, Stanley had kind of stacked the deck in that what he did is he hired a confederate or a friend to be the person that was quote unquote receiving the shocks. Unknowingly, no actual shock was being administered, but this was because the course participants, or the study participants rather, they were seated at a chair and they were told that if they hit this button whenever a question was wrong, or whenever instructed by Stanley Milgram himself, they were instructed to hit this button and administer that shock, but they didn't know that no shock was actually being delivered. Of course, because, they wanted to control for any potential damage that could be done, or in this case, Stanley Milgram was trying to prove a point. Now imagine this for a minute, all right, if this isn't making sense to you yet. Imagine you're placed in a chair, and an authority figure, right, somebody who's asking you and they recruited you for this psychological experiment, has said, hey, you're going to administer a shock to this individual over there whenever they get a question wrong. Now, this shock is going to elevate, or it's going to escalate rather, in its potency and electrical charge for every question they get wrong. So if they get 10 questions wrong, we've got to move that voltage up significantly, as opposed to when they started with the first question. Now, of course, some people were hesitant right off the bat. And he said, listen, it's critical because this study can help thousands, if not tens of thousands of people across the world. You're really contributing to a greater good here. Now, what he did is he deceptively made them think the same thing that really dictators and people of that kind were doing all across the world, right? Like they say, perform this act, it's for the greater good. Guys, this is how a lot of cults are really formed. People partake in a belief because they think it's going to lead to an altruistic outcome. So what Milgram had done is he had told the confederate, or the actors who were sitting in the chair and to be receiving the shock, to scream every time that buzzer was hit. And he wanted to see just how far these seemingly normal people that would be administering the shock would go. And what he found is well over 65% of those involved in the study were willing to continue to administer shocks, even to the point that it could lead to death, as long as they felt like they believed they were contributing to a greater good. And the point of this study, even though it was highly contentious at the time and still to this day, is that he was able to show that seemingly normal, rational individuals, when put in a certain situation, would go so far as to possibly harm another individual. Now, when you look at this, there's another example, and perhaps one a little bit more indelible to most of you because it was popularized in a famous movie, was the Stanford prison experiment. Now, very similar scenario. Only this time, people were recruited to take part in a prison study. So a gentleman, a researcher, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, who worked at Stanford University, converted a building on Stanford's campus to look identical to a prison. And they recruited a number of participants who, via the flip of the coin, were either assigned to be prisoners or guards. And this was pretty no holds barred. The only thing that the guards couldn't do is administer actual physical pain to those that were the prisoners. Now, keep in mind, all these people underwent psychological evaluation prior to the study and were shown to be otherwise perfectly normal. So none of them came in a situation where they were violent offenders or predisposed to violence necessarily. The ad simply said, we're doing a study to look at the psychological effects on prison life, and we'll pay you X amount a day. Well, the study was originally designed to go on for 2 weeks. It had to be stopped after only 6 days because people were taking really, and it was the guards, were taking it so far that they had originally just lost the identity that this was a a mock kind of exercise. These people were really starting to abuse their authority. They were doing things well out of the normal set of instructions that were given to them. They were psychologically abusing these people, sleep deprivation, and again, all normal people assigned via the flip of the coin. And people that were in the prisoner side of things were starting to experience intense kind of psychological breakdowns of all kinds. So they stopped the experiment immediately. Dr. Philip Zimbardo came under attack, and he said, listen, I'm trying to just show how the mere act of assigning labels and putting people in unique situations is sufficient enough to elicit pathological behavior. And intuitively, many of you know this, right? If the world were to end today and there was some cataclysmic or apocalyptic event, do you really think that the majority of people would act rationally? Do you think that all these people that we know in our lives who, normally the consummate professional, very polite, is everybody going to continue to adhere to standards of that kind? Or are we more than likely to see things that we see during natural disasters, looting, people robbing, people doing all kinds of terrible things? So these aren't terrible stretches of the imagination that showcase, listen, people will react in certain ways if you put them in certain situations. Now, these are extreme examples through the research to drive home this point. Your athletes are not that different. All of these individuals come from varieties of different backgrounds, some broken homes. Some come from more like kind of bucolic situations where they're in the countryside and they may have a different upbringing. Some love lifting weights and training, some don't. You have to consider the situation and the environment, not just the individual when you're trying to make sense of behavior. So now let's look at social interaction. And again, an abbreviated view here, but I'll try to make sure and take it as slow as I can so that nothing's missed. When we look at this, we haven't looked too much in the research about how conflict is really started with athletes and their coaches. Thankfully, there's some people out there like Walksmith, Dr. Jowett, and Chris Harwood that have done some unique aspects here, or unique research here. But when people consider factors that influence an athlete's performance, very rarely do they look at the social side. And, this is a unique study in that it looked at a number of high-level performers, primarily Olympians, and they go into great detail about how they feel like performance had been affected due to social kind of just issues they had with their coach or their team and where they felt conflict. And it's not saying that, hey, you need to be soft, loving, and warm. It's just saying you need to understand sometimes what you can be doing wrong as a coach that can lead to these issues. Because remember the fundamental attribution error. A lot of times we think, oh, it's the athlete or it's this. Coaches, you have got to take accountability for your part as well. Now, within the sport literature, as I mentioned, only a few empirical studies have directly examined the concept of conflict, right? And this has actually been done at relatively high levels. You're looking at people that have participated in European championships, World Cups, and Olympic Games. This isn't the classical physiological study of the adaptation of a back squat or linear-based periodization program on, 14 novice trainees who just started recreationally exercising and all that, like we're so used to seeing. And when looking at these high-level athletes in these examples here on this slide, the finding was that conflict was experienced by nearly 75% of participants, and N equals 90 here, who occupied roles as either coaches, athletes, managers, or external agents. So in other words, when we look at this study done in 2017, it didn't just look at conflict from a social standpoint on behalf of the athletes. It looked at it in three particular domains: the cognitive domain, affective domain, and relational domain, on not only the athletes, but the coaches and managers themselves. And us taking stock and doing this research and knowing how we may be contributing to greater conflict or conflict of different types is critical, and it's important that we as coaches go through that. Now, I do have an aspect of the course on artofcoaching.com that talks about how we can better self-reflect and evaluate certain behaviors we're using to better kind of help us and do something actionable about this, as opposed to just reading the research and being aware of it. I'm going to skip by this for now. It just speaks to the point of, how interpersonal, intrapersonal, and external factors can really lead to different determinants and consequences of the different types of conflict. And I go more in depth on this in the course, but it's a little bit beyond the scope for the sake of this 40-minute webinar. Now, here's a critical point to get across, right? So when we're looking at the art of coaching, there is still a lot of debate about what the definition of coaching truly is in the literature. Despite that, though, the imagery associated with the task is always social in nature. And this is why we have to continue to study these things. There is never going to be a point in time where athletes are universally going to operate without the guidance of a coach. This social interaction is critical. And so when we're looking at tools to help us better make sense of this, because we know that if we want to do programming, we can look at upper push, lower pull, hip dominant, knee dominant exercises. But what variables help us kind of mix up the board from a social standpoint? What tools or frameworks can we operate off of? Well, looking at research done from 1997, really what comes down to coaching effectiveness and leadership effectiveness overall is the ability to identify, analyze, and control these variables that affect an athlete's performance. So that's great. How can we better define these things? And this is where we have to dive into the business literature a little bit more, things that have gone on in corporate environments. And research done by Gary Uckel at the University of Albany, who's been doing this stuff for well over 30 years, says, well, you really need to understand the definitions of power and influence. And in his context, power is defined by the ability to bring about change in one's psychological environment, whereas influence is the use of that power to bring about change. And we talk about this a little bit more in depth on artofcoaching.com in the course Bought In, but I'm going to give you a little highlight and kind of intro here. So, what Dr. Uckel says is influence is the essence of leadership. And when you're coaching or leading others, the issue is never whether leaders will use power, but whether they'll use it wisely and well. And most really don't. I mean, you see a lot of strength coaches today that still try to take this militant type of approach. They try to use this kind of positivistic determinants or dominance to get people to do things. So you'll see coaches that either will force their athletes to do it or really yell and accountability and are kind of harsh. And you'll see others that are kind of a little bit more warm and empathetic and positive, and they speak to all these kind of cliched terms. And it's not about what's right or wrong, because all of you are going to have different coaching styles, and there is never going to be one universally best coaching style for all athletes. What you need to understand is where on the spectrum you exist and how you're using your method of influence, power, when coaching or leading your athletes. So Dr. Uckel's research goes on to continue to define these things in a variety of ways. He says, listen, the key terms here you need to know are agents, targets, and tactics. Well, agents are us. We as coaches are the primary driver of behavior change. So we're the agents in this example. Targets is a terminology he uses to define the athletes or the individuals we're hoping to influence. And then tactics, of course, is what we're really trying to call upon here. So when we look at influence tactics, and this is from his article done and research done in 1990 in the Journal of Applied Psychology, he says that really there's 11 primary influence tactics. Now, not all of them are mentioned here. And again, this goes a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar, but it's discussed more in depth within my course Bought In. He says, but looking at these tactics is really, the best way to get a grip on not only ones you may be using or not using, but are you using them effectively? And they're not meant to blow your mind. They're meant to exist as a menu and say, okay, some athletes are going to respond better to legitimating tactics. Some are going to respond more to personal appeals or inspirational appeals. Others might need more pressure-based tactics. And again, these are defined within the course, but we go through examples of not only every single one of these tactics, but also kind of where they occur, how you can be aware of them, how you can leverage them. And then we also give a lot of examples as well as a printable PDF or cheat sheet of not only the tactics themselves, but their definitions and applications. The way I'm going to leave you today is thinking of it this way, because we talk about periodization for people. As you learn more about the tactics, hopefully as you go through the course on artofcoaching.com and you understand the different categorizations, and we talk about there's hard tactics and define what that means, in which coalition, legitimating, and pressure tactics take place. Rational tactics, rational persuasion, such as giving them facts and figures and research to hopefully persuade them or influence them. Consultation tactics and collaboration tactics. And then soft tactics, exchange, inspirational, and personal appeals. These exist on the same sort of kind of mental model spectrum as intensity and volume do within our programming. We know that certain more intensive tactics can be used, but not quite as frequently. So just like we can't train maximal strength, or we really shouldn't, for 8, 10, 12 weeks at a time, because it can really drain the central nervous system reserves and take a tremendous impact on CNS resources, especially when dealing with competitive athletes. You wouldn't want to overuse hard tactics, but it exists. The same holds true on the other end of the spectrum. Even though you look at local muscular endurance or more hypertrophic rep ranges, sure, that may not cause the same kind of breakdown or fatigue from a neuromuscular standpoint, but there's also the impact it has on more of the mechanical tissue breakdown, right? And the same thing happens if we overuse rational tactics or soft tactics. The point is, to be skilled at the art of coaching, you need to know which of these tactics to draw upon and what amounts at what times with what individuals. And guys, that is what I'm trying to teach, not only with the book, but my course bought in on artofcoaching.com. I hope to see you in that. We're having some great discussions about these things. Again, we dive fully in depth on the archetypes, influence tactics, and all of these topics to really help you get a better view of what they are and how they can be utilized. We also talk about a variety of coaching strategies. What are the myths in terms of coaching that we've heard in terms of coach development, communication styles? We talk about, really the neural side of things, what goes into behavior, what drives athletes, why is motivation really a BS term, and what should we be looking at? What does the research show that we should be looking at instead of motivation to better understand, again, these root causes? Guys, if you don't take the time to understand behavior, it's akin to you trying to create a program for your athletes without doing a full-scale analysis and breakdown of their sport demands and everything else. I hope to see you in the course. My thanks to Owen. Owen's resource on the Research Digest is tremendous. I know it's been a huge value to me, and I hope together resources like his and my own continue to guide you on your coaching journey. Thanks again. And I hope to see you in the course on June 27th at artofcoaching.com.